A rifle stock slammed into the cabin door. Wood splintered. A voice shouted something ugly through the gap. 5 women pressed against the wall inside, hands tight over their children's mouths. One held a knife. Another held nothing but her own steady breathing. Outside, 3 horses kicked up dust around the porch. The men on those horses were not lawmen. They were not soldiers. They were the kind who came when nobody was watching, and they had counted every face on this ranch except one. Behind the women, a back door creaked open. An old man stepped onto the porch with a Winchester in his hands and gray in his beard. His name was Silas Kane. He had not fired that rifle in 9 years. What happened in the next 90 seconds turned a quiet ranch into a story the territory whispered for decades. Stay with me on this one. 6 months before that night, nobody had set foot on the ranch in over a year. Silas Kane lived on 160 acres in the Sulphur Springs Valley, Arizona Territory. The year was 1886. Geronimo had surrendered weeks earlier, and most folks figured the Apache Wars were finally finished. Silas had no strong opinion either way. He had not ridden past his own fence line in 4 months. His wife Mary had been dead 9 years. The ranch was hers as much as his. Her father had given them the land as a wedding gift when they came west from Missouri. After Mary died, Silas kept the cattle for 2 seasons, then sold most of them off. He kept only what he needed for himself and the 2 old horses in the barn. The rest of the time, he sat on the porch and watched the light change on the Chiricahua Mountains. He was 61 years old. His beard was gray. His knees ached when the cold came in. His Winchester hung over the front door, not because he expected trouble, but because that is where it had hung for 30 years. Now here is the thing about a man who has spent 9 years alone. He stops noticing what he has stopped doing. Silas no longer cooked real meals. He no longer spoke aloud, not even to himself. He did not notice the ranch was slowly going back to dust around him. Then, on a Tuesday evening in late September, somebody knocked on his door. Silas reached for the Winchester before he reached for the latch. He cracked the door open 4 inches. 5 women stood on his porch. 3 children stood behind them. The oldest was around 40. Her hair was streaked with iron gray. Her face was the kind of tired you only get from walking a week. The youngest could not have been more than 19. She was holding a baby wrapped in a strip of army blanket. The other 3 were somewhere in between. They wore long skirts patched with deer hide. Their feet were wrapped in rags. The oldest woman spoke first. Her English was slow and careful. "We are walking to the reservation. There is no food on the trail. We have been 3 days without water until we found your creek." Silas said nothing. "We are not asking to stay. We are asking for 1 night. We will sleep in your barn. We will leave at sunup." Silas opened the door another 2 inches. He looked past her at the children. One of them, a little girl no more than 4, was holding the hem of her mother's skirt. She looked up at him with eyes that did not blink. Silas had buried 2 children of his own before they reached that age. He had not let himself think about that in a long time. He thought about it now. He should have said no. He knew it even as he stepped back from the door. "Barn's drafty," he said. "Got a fire in the kitchen. Come in." The oldest woman stared at him for a long second, like she was trying to figure out if she had heard him right. Then she turned and spoke quickly to the others in a language Silas had never learned. They came in slowly, the way deer come into a clearing. He learned their names that first night. The eldest was Naya. Her husband, a man called Standing Crow, had been killed by raiders 8 months back. The next was Dolly, her sister, also a widow. Then Tsila, a quiet woman of about 30, whose husband died of fever on the long walk to the reservation. Then Bidziai, a stocky woman in her late 20s, whose husband was hanged by a rancher who claimed he stole a horse. Then the youngest, Lozan, 19, with a baby boy and a dead husband killed in that same hanging. 5 widows, 3 children, 1 ranch. Silas fed them what he had: beans, hard bread, coffee. The children ate first. The women ate after. Silas sat in the corner with his hat in his hand and watched them, because he did not know what else to do. That night, Naya laid the children down on his kitchen floor. The women slept against the walls. Silas slept in his chair. In the morning, they did not leave. He did not ask them to. By the end of the first week, Dolly had cleaned the kitchen down to the boards. By the end of the second week, Bidziai had repaired the corral fence with her own hands. By the end of the third week, Sila was milking the goats and Lozan was hunting rabbits with a borrowed knife. And Naya was teaching the children to count in 3 languages. Her own, English, and Spanish. Silas wore his wife's wedding ring on a leather cord around his neck. He had worn it for 9 years. He could feel it against his chest now, where before he had stopped noticing it was there. He still did not call them family. Not yet. But the ranch was no longer quiet. By the second month, Silas could not put off going to town any longer. The ranch needed coffee and salt and a new bridle leather and 10 things he could not make with his own hands. So one morning he saddled his old buckskin gelding, took a list Naya had written out for him, and rode the 8 miles into Cochise. Cochise was not much of a town. 1 main street, a hardware store, a saloon, a bank, a feed store, a post that called itself the marshal's office, though the territorial marshal only came through about once a season. Silas tied his horse outside the hardware store. He had been coming here for 30 years. He nodded at men he had known since they were boys. 3 of them did not nod back. He went in. He laid the list on the counter. The clerk, a man named Henderson, looked at the list. Then he looked at Silas. Then he looked back at the list. "This is a lot of flour, Silas." "That's right." "And cornmeal. And beans." "That's right." Henderson set the list down. He spoke low. "Silas, you and me been friends a long time. You sure you know what you're doing out there?" Silas felt something go cold in his chest. He didn't answer. He just laid down his money. Henderson filled the order. Silas carried it out to his horse. That's when Burdick stepped out of the saloon. Cyrus Burdick owned the biggest cattle outfit in the southern half of the valley. He had a hard square face and a mustache that came down past the corners of his mouth. He had 2 men with him. "Kane," Burdick said. Silas tied the second sack to his saddle. "Burdick, heard you got company up at your place." Silas didn't answer. 5 squaws. "That right." The word hit the street like a shot. A few people across the way slowed down to listen. Silas turned slow. He looked Burdick in the face. "They're widows. They got nowhere else. They got a reservation. That's where they go. Reservation is 200 miles north. Ration agent steals half what comes through. Half the women up there don't make it through one winter. Not your problem. Made it my problem." Burdick spat into the dirt. "You think people round here forgot what Apaches did? You think we forgot Cooper's wife? Forgot the Whitlock boys? Those women on my place didn't do any of that. They're Apache. That's all I need to know. And I'll tell you something, Kane. There's men in this town who won't have it. There's me. There's about 10 others. And the longer those women sit on your land, the worse it's going to get for you." Silas finished tying down the supplies. Then he turned and walked right up to Burdick. He stopped about a foot from his face. He spoke quiet. "You come on my land, Burdick, you better bring more than 10. He mounted the buckskin and rode out. He did not look back. That ride home was the longest 8 miles he had ridden in 9 years. He felt every one of his 61 years in his back. He felt his wife's wedding ring against his chest like a coin pressed into his skin. When he got back to the ranch, he unloaded the supplies without speaking. Then he called the women into the kitchen and told them what Burdick had said. Naya listened with her arms folded. When he was finished, she nodded once. "How many?" He said 10. Probably 4 or 5 who'd actually ride out here at night. "When?" "I don't know. Could be tomorrow. Could be a month. Could be never. But we plan like it's tomorrow. He told them the rules. No going to town. No traveling alone. Stay close to the buildings between sundown and sunup. Lozen would watch the perimeter because she had quick eyes. Bidziai would handle the children if anything happened. Doli and Sila would manage the kitchen. Naya would speak for them all if any law came to the door. That night, Silas pulled the Winchester down off the wall and cleaned it for the first time in 9 years. Now here is what happened 3 days later. Lozen went out to set rabbit snares along the creek bed. She was alone, which was against the rules, but the children needed meat and Bidziai was sick. She took her knife and her husband's old pistol and she went. She did not come home until after dark. When she came in, her lip was split. There was blood crusted on her temple. Her shirt was torn at the collar. Silas met her at the door. How many? 3. She spat blood on the porch. On horses. They came up out of the wash. Did you fire? Twice. I hit one in the leg. Then I ran. Did they follow? For a mile. Then I went into the rocks. They lost me. Did they recognize you? They knew I was Apache. Silas put his hand on her shoulder for a second. Then he sent Doli to clean her up. That night, Silas slept on the porch with the Winchester across his knees. Naya sat with him until midnight. They will come, she said. I know. Tomorrow. Probably. Tomorrow came. Nothing happened. The day after came. Nothing happened. The third day came. Nothing happened. Silas began to wonder if Burdick was just a man who liked to talk. He had known men like that. Loud in the saloon. Quiet on the trail. Maybe Burdick was no different. On the 4th morning, Silas slept until full light for the first time in a week. When he came out of the cabin, Naya was already at the kitchen fire. The smell of fresh bread came out of the open door. The little girl who had stared at him through the crack in the door 2 months ago. Her name was Sani. She was sitting on the porch step. She was holding a wooden horse Silas had carved her. The first thing he had whittled in 9 years. She was making it gallop along the porch rail. Silas sat down beside her. He took the cup of coffee Naya brought him. For the first time in 9 years, he smiled. Not because something was funny, just because he was sitting on his porch on a clean morning with a child beside him and the smell of bread in the air. He took a sip of the coffee. He looked at the wooden horse galloping along the rail. The wind rattled the door behind him. He set the coffee down. A rifle shot cracked across the valley. Sani jumped. Silas was already moving. He grabbed the little girl by the back of her dress and pushed her through the open door into Naya's arms. He came back out with the Winchester. A second shot. Farther up the ridge. He heard a horse scream. He squinted up the slope. About 400 yards out where the rocks gave way to scrub. A figure on horseback already turning to ride away. Silas raised the Winchester and held the figure in his sights. Then he lowered it. Too far. Bad shot. He did not want to start with a missed one. He walked out to the corral. His old buckskin gelding was lying on his side. A bullet through the neck. Dead. A piece of paper was nailed to the corral post with a knife. It was a single line. Next one's you. Now here is the thing about a man like Cyrus Burdick. He understood that fear works better than violence, until it doesn't. Killing a man's horse is a message. Says, I can reach you. I can take what's yours. The next thing I take will be more than a horse. Silas pulled the knife out of the post. He folded up the paper. He buried the buckskin himself with a shovel all afternoon, while the women watched from the porch. That evening, just before dark, a rider came up the road from town. He was a young man in a clean shirt and a brown coat. He held both his hands up where Silas could see them. He held a folded paper in his right hand. I'm with the marshal's office, he said. Don't shoot. Silas let him approach. He took the paper. He read it. The paper was from Marshal Joseph Adair, Territorial Marshal, signed 2 days before in Tucson. It said that 5 Apache women, names not specified, were on record as fugitives from the San Carlos Reservation. A complaint had been filed by the Cochise County Sheriff. The marshal was duty-bound to investigate. Silas Kane was to surrender the said women to federal custody within 72 hours, or be charged with harboring federal fugitives. Silas folded the paper. He looked up at the rider. Who filed the complaint? Sheriff Whitlock. Whitlock works for Burdick. Half this county does. The young man did not answer. Silas nodded slow. You go on back. Tell the marshal I'll come see him myself tomorrow. The young man rode off. Silas stood on his porch and held the paper for a long time. This was different now. Burdick was a man with a gun and a grudge. The marshal was the United States. Burdick could be shot. The United States could not. He went inside. He showed Naya the paper. She read it carefully. She had been to mission school for 6 years before she was married, and she could read English better than him. She looked up. You will give us up? He took a long breath. I will not. She did not cry. She did not thank him. She just nodded once. Now if you're still with me on this one, and I hope you are because this is where it gets hard, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. There's more coming, and you don't want to miss what happens at dawn. Stay with me. The next morning, Silas rode into town on Naya's borrowed mule. He went to the marshal's office. Adair was a tired man with a mustache and gray eyes. He had been a marshal for 22 years. Mr. Kane. Marshal. I assume you know why you're here. I do. And those women have been on my place 64 days. I won't put them out. Adair leaned back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at his hands. I don't make these laws, Mr. Kane. I just enforce them. And I have a paper here says they go back. That paper was signed by a sheriff who answers to a man who's already shot up my place once. Burdick. You know him. I know him. Then you know what's really going on. Adair was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I have 72 hours, Mr. Kane. After that, I have to move. I don't want to, but I will. Silas stood up. Then I expect you'll do your duty. He walked out. He rode home slow. He had 8 miles to think, and he did. By the time he came up the road, he had decided one thing. He was not going to wait for either of them. That night, he doubled the watches. Bidsey was on the south fence with the pistol. Lozen was on the north ridge with his spare rifle. Naya was at the kitchen window. Dolly and Sela had the children in the back root cellar with bread and water and the door barred. Silas was on the porch. Burdick came at 3 in the morning. Not 72 hours later. Not even 48. He never had any intention of waiting for the marshal. The first thing Silas saw was the orange glow on the south side of the barn. The second thing he heard was Bidsey shouting. The barn was on fire. Silas grabbed 2 buckets and ran. Naya was already at the well. Dolly and Sela formed a chain. Lozen came down off the ridge at a flat run. The roof was already going. The hay had caught. There were 2 old saddles inside that barn. One of them was his wife Mary's. It had her initials burned into the leather. Silas ran into the burning barn. He came out with the saddle in his arms, his beard singed, his eyes streaming. The roof came down behind him not 3 seconds later. The barn burned to the ground. The cabin did not. They saved it. By dawn, the south wall of the cabin was black with smoke, but every soul on the ranch was alive. Silas sat in the dirt with his wife's saddle across his knees. Naya sat down beside him. Her face was streaked with ash. Her hands were burned in 2 places. Tomorrow night, she said. Tomorrow night, Silas said. They did not need to say more. The next night, Silas did not sleep. Lozen was on the north ridge by sunset. Bidsey was at the south fence. Naya was at the kitchen window with Silas's old single-action revolver. Dolly and Sela had the 3 children in the root cellar with a sack of bread, 2 canteens, and 2 feet of earth between them and any bullet. That was the plan. At 5:15 in the morning, Lozen came running down off the ridge. 4 men. 2 more on the rim. One has a long gun. Silas thought about that for 1 second. Bidsey, south fence. You see the flank, you fire. Lozen. With me. He took her around to the back of the cabin. He showed her the dry creek bed that ran behind the property. You go down this. You come up behind that ridge. You take that long gun out before he takes me out. She looked at him. You can do this? She did not answer. She just took the spare rifle and disappeared into the creek bed. That left Silas, Naya at the window, and Bidsey at the fence. The 3 riders came up the road 5 minutes later. Burdick was in front. He had 2 men with him. They were big, and they had rifles across their saddles. A rifle stock slammed into the cabin door. Wood splintered. A voice shouted something ugly through the gap. Now I told you at the start that 5 women were pressed against the wall inside, hands tight over their children's mouths. Here is the truth of it. The children were already in the cellar. The 2 women in the cabin were Naya at the window with the revolver and Dolly at the back door with a butcher knife. The 5th woman was Lozen, and she was already a half-mile up a dry creek bed with a rifle on her shoulder. Burdick stood up in his stirrups. Kane, bring him out. Silas stepped onto the porch with the Winchester. You're on my land, Burdick. Bring him out, or I'll burn the cabin to the ground with everybody in it. Behind the cabin, far up the ridge, a rifle shot cracked. Burdick's head turned. His sharpshooter on the rim was no longer a problem. Burdick understood it in a second. His face changed. He drew. Silas was already moving. He fired from the hip. The Winchester hit Burdick's right-hand man in the chest. The man fell sideways out of his saddle. Burdick's other man fired wild. The bullet hit the porch post 6 inches from Silas's ear. Silas worked the lever and put the next round through that man's shoulder. He dropped his rifle. He turned his horse and ran. Burdick was off his horse now. He had his pistol up. He fired twice. The first one hit Silas in the leg. The second one missed. Silas went down on one knee. Burdick walked toward him. He was smiling. He was the kind of man who had killed before and liked it. "Old man," he said, "you should have stayed in your damn rocking chair." Sonny screamed. She had heard the shots. She had thought her mother was hurt. She came running up out of the cellar and around the corner of the cabin before anyone could stop her. She was 4 years old and barefoot, and she was screaming for Naya. She ran straight into the open between Silas and Burdick. Burdick swung his pistol toward her. He did it without thinking. He did it because she was Apache and 4 years old, and he was that kind of man. Naya came through the kitchen window in a blur. She did not stop at the porch. She hit Sonny at a flat run and rolled with her behind the water trough. Burdick fired. The bullet went into the wood of the trough. It did not come through. He turned back to Silas. It was the second he looked away that killed him. Silas was on the ground with the Winchester, and his leg was bleeding, but his hands were still steady. He did not stand up. He did not yell. He just brought the Winchester up to his shoulder from where he sat, and he sighted on Burdick's chest, and he fired 1 round. It went through the second button of Burdick's coat. Burdick stood there for half a second longer. Then he sat down in the dirt and fell over and did not get up. The morning went quiet. Bidsey came around the south fence with the pistol. Lozen came down off the ridge with the spare rifle and a man's hat she had taken off the dead sharpshooter. Dolly came out of the back door with the butcher knife and her hands shaking. Sela came up from the cellar with Sonny in her arms. Naya was already on her feet. The whole fight had taken less than 90 seconds. 5 horses came up the road from the south. Marshal Adair was on the lead horse. The young rider in the brown coat was beside him. There were 3 deputies behind them. Adair came up the road slow. He looked at Burdick. He looked at the man Silas had killed. He looked at the body Lozen had brought down off the ridge. He looked at the burned barn from 2 nights before. He dismounted. He walked over to Silas, who was still sitting in the dirt. "Mr. Kane. Marshal. Tell me what happened here. They came on my land. Tried to burn me out 2 nights ago. Tried to shoot me this morning. I defended my home." Adair looked at the women. He looked at the cellar door open in the side of the hill. He looked at Sonny in Sela's arms. "Anybody else fire on these men?" There was a long silence. Then Adair nodded. "Self-defense, Mr. Kane. 3 witnesses are enough for a federal report. I'll write it up myself." He paused. "And the matter of the warrant. I think we may need to take another look at how that complaint got filed." He turned and ordered the deputies to load the bodies onto the spare horses. Silas closed his eyes. He did not pass out from the leg wound. But he wanted to. The bullet in his leg came out 3 days later in the Cochise doctor's office. He spent a week on his porch with his foot up. By then, the news had spread. Most folks in Cochise did not say anything to him. A few stopped to nod. The hardware store man Henderson came out one afternoon with a bag of peppermint sticks for the children and an apology that he could not quite get all the way out of his mouth. Silas took the candy. He did not take the apology. He told Henderson to keep it for himself. He needed it more. The marshal was as good as his word. He went to Tucson and pulled on the warrant for 2 weeks. He found that the original complaint had no signatures from the reservation agent, which it was supposed to have. He found that the names on the complaint did not match the women on the ranch. He found that Sheriff Whitlock had filed 3 other complaints in 2 years that were paper-thin in the same way. By the end of November, a new paper came in the mail. It was an authorization, signed by the territorial governor, allowing 5 Apache women, Naya, Dolly, Sela, Bidziai, and Lozin, to remain on the Kane Ranch as registered ranch workers. It was not citizenship. It was not a deed. But it was real, and it was signed, and it could be taken to any sheriff who came up the road and wanted trouble. Silas pinned that paper to the inside of the kitchen door, where every one of them could see it. Then he started rebuilding the barn. Bidziai drove the post holes. Lozin carried the beams. Sela mixed the mortar. Dolly ran the kitchen so the men they hired from town could be fed. Naya kept the books because she could read and write better than any of them. Yes, they hired men from town. 3 of them. 2 were Mexican brothers named Reyes. 1 was a young white man named Tom who had grown up on a farm in Kansas and did not have an opinion about Apaches one way or the other. They worked for 2 months and got paid every Friday. None of them ever had a problem with anyone on the ranch, except the time Tom dropped a beam on his foot and Bidziai laughed at him. The barn went up by Christmas. The cattle came back in January. 12 head, bought with money Silas had been saving for 9 years and never spent. By spring there were 24 head. By the next summer there were 60. The ranch came alive. The children grew. Sonny, the little girl who had stared at Silas through a 4-inch crack in his door, started calling him Chare, which Naya said was a word for grandfather in their language. He did not correct her. He did not deserve it, but he did not correct her. He taught her to ride a horse. He taught her to throw a rope. He taught her to sit a saddle the way he had taught his own daughter. Before his daughter died of fever at the age of 3 and broke a piece of him, he thought no one would ever fix. Sonny fixed it. She did not know that. She was 4, then 5, then 6. She just liked to ride. One evening in the second summer, Silas sat on the porch. Naya brought him a cup of coffee, the way she had every morning and every evening for almost 2 years. She sat down beside him. The sun was going down behind the Chiricahua Mountains. The light was the color of an old penny. He did not look at her. He looked at the mountains. "My wife," he said. "She was named Mary. We had 2 children. They both died young. After Mary went, I figured I was done. I figured the rest of my life was a long porch in a quiet house. I figured I'd earned that, even if it wasn't what I wanted." Naya did not answer right away. Then she said, "My husband was named Standing Crow. He was a good hunter. He could hear a deer breathing from a half-mile. He was killed by men who came up out of the South Wash with rifles, while he was teaching our nephew how to set a snare. I figured I was done too. I figured the rest of my life was a walk to a place I did not want to go. They sat for a long time. Silas reached up to his neck. He took off the leather cord. The wedding ring slid off into his hand. He had worn that ring for 9 years and 3 months. He stood up. He walked across the yard, past the rebuilt barn, to the old apple tree his wife Mary had planted the year they came to the ranch. The tree was 26 years old and still bore fruit every year. He knelt down. He dug a small hole at the base of the tree with his hands. He laid the ring in the hole. He said, "Goodbye, Mary." He covered the ring with dirt. He stood up and walked back to the porch. Naya was still sitting there. He sat down beside her. He took her hand. That was all. That was the whole thing. He took her hand and he held it, and the sun went down behind the Chiricahua Mountains, and the smell of bread came out of the kitchen, and somewhere in the corral a child was laughing. The ranch had been quiet for 9 years. It was not quiet anymore. It was full. And the old man on the porch, the one who had stood in his back doorway with a Winchester and gray in his beard, finally understood what the door had really opened on that night 2 years ago, when 5 strangers had asked him for 1 night of shelter. It had not opened on 5 widows. It had opened on a home.